many questions in as possible before we break for dinner. So feel free. Gentleman there.
Thank you very much. My name is Yogendra Kumar. I'm former ambassador. I actually wanted to ask Dr. Ahluwalia, you were the co-chair with Canada of that particular committee in G20, which was looking at the, in a way, a kind of a future, your future vision of the global economy in terms of adjusting balances and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering, how is that proceeding? And is it making some impact, at least on the professional thinking that you talked about? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll collect 3 or 4. Yeah, there's a gentleman back there, yes.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Saurabh Agarwal, Vice Chairman, Indian Institute of Finance. So you said that cooperation among G20 countries can take place only in infrastructure. Now, I would appreciate if you can kindly elucidate how come this, this recent introduction of REITs and infrastructure, how can G20 countries benefit from this new provision in the current, this time presentation of budget? REITs has been introduced. How can that, and how do countries cooperate in terms of infrastructure?
Yes, there's a gentleman here.
My name is Tushar Pandey. I'm from Yes Bank. On infrastructure and food security, with respect to specific, Indian needs, agri-infrastructure and value chain in infrastructure also becomes a, interlinkage with the food security in some respects. So would you have a overarching comment on the fact that it is not only infrastructure, but some other sectors could be where G20 and international cooperation could also be, because they are actually linked to infrastructure as such. They have a bearing on food security. So your thoughts on that?
Okay.
Good evening. I am Chandrasen from Grameen Vikas Trust. I wanted to ask a very simple question as to who benefited from stimulus. The structure of a stimuli in different countries. Is it related to the unemployment?
Okay, I'm sure I can't actually answer to everyone's satisfaction, so let me just kind of quickly go over. One is that I didn't co-chair with Canada, that was on the finance track. So I think our finance deputy was co-chairing with the Canadian deputy. And my recollection is that that's what really led ultimately to the MAP process. And the MAP process has been functioning and is at work. And as I said, it hasn't produced, and nobody seriously thought it would produce a completely agreed work program that, country X says, I'm going to have this fiscal deficit and that current account deficit. But it put everybody on the table, created a sense where people shared a certain perspective. And the only difference is that, it hasn't actually led to the kind of growth revival that we wanted. And as I said, the reason for that is more fundamental, and that is that most macroeconomists have understated the impediments to real economy recovery when the financial system is broke. And now it's well established, people like Rogoff and others have written, that the recovery from a financial crisis is much longer than the recovery from just a normal macroeconomic crisis. And I think these aspects were underplayed. They were then offset by, in my view, unrealistic assumptions that if we do 2 or 3 things and we call them reforms, this will lead to a huge revival of confidence and investment will start flowing. That clearly didn't happen. So I think that's my answer. On the investment in real estate investment trusts, the thing that we've just, let me say that when we liberalize the economy, everybody else can do more with us, which is welcome, and the G20 countries can do more with us. But that's not a negotiated outcome. That is us liberalizing. People come in. Since the G20 are generally the more important fellows, many of them come in. When I talk about negotiation, you sit down with each other and say, well, look, Let's agree that the international system is going to function in a particular way. So I think that is simply a case where unilaterally we have opened up one part of the economy. I don't think it's an issue. The G20 would probably welcome it. They would generally welcome any kind of opening up. And they would say, look, it's for you to decide whether this is going to make you more stable or less stable. And that comes to the last question, the who benefits from stability.
Stimulus.
Hmm?
Fiscal stimulus.
Who benefits from stability or who benefits from fiscal
Fiscal
stimulus? Ah, that's a very, very much more complex issue. You know, when you say who benefits, I think you've got to first decide, is the stimulus going to be effective or not? If the stimulus is effective, the benefit is very broad-based. If the stimulus is not effective, then there are probably costs and not too many benefits. But that again is something which, I mean, the situation differs from country to country. I mean, it's well known in India that, you know, we were right to start a stimulus when we did, and we should have withdrawn it much earlier than we did. I mean, the danger with stimulus is all a bit like drugs. You know, once you get onto it, it's extremely difficult to get off. And there's also this question of the quality of the stimulus. I mean, all economists will tell you that if you're going to have a stimulus, for God's sake, have it on investment, and that too investment in infrastructure. But then all the practical people will tell you that, you know, to get an investment program going takes about 6 to 8 months, a lot of preparatory work. So if you're going to have a stimulus, the quickie stimulus is always some form of support to consumption. And that's a balancing act that you have to somehow follow. You know, let me just talk about infrastructure for 1 minute. You know, the crux about infrastructure is when should governments cooperate? Obviously, governments collectively create an agreement on how global governance or the global government institutions will function. I think it's generally recognized that governments should come in when there's a market failure. In my view, there is massive market failure on the infrastructure front. In a lot of the debates that used to take place in the G20, when the developing countries said we must invest in infrastructure, there would be a natural pushback saying, oh my God, these chaps want more aid or want more World Bank lending and this and that and the other. So there was a sort of a reluctance to do anything. So what I'm saying is that suppose you've agreed on what the level of World Bank lending is going to be. And in my view, the agreement at the moment is too conservative. That's a separate issue which the G20 should also take up. But what I'm saying is that if you've agreed on what the World Bank lending is going to be, should you put that lending into what is the direct poverty alleviation projects, or should you put more of it into infrastructure? Now, I'm deliberately putting it in a manner where you can immediately see that many people will disagree. If you believe there's a massive market failure in infrastructure, and putting multilateral funds into infrastructure will then leverage a lot more private funds into infrastructure, and then look at what the impact of that infrastructure will be on private investment and employment and all the rest of it, and therefore on poverty. It may well be the case that even if you're really concerned about the impact on the poor, you're probably much better off using this sort of money to leverage more going into infrastructure. This is not without controversy. Even in our country, there are a lot of people who will disagree with that. But that's the issue that we need to really focus on and resolve. And I think that actually, for many reasons, countries that otherwise you know that if they were to build the infrastructure, a lot of private investment would come in, a lot of growth would happen, and all the rest of it, are not able to do that because the market doesn't actually believe that they will run these projects well. And that's where organizations like multilateral organizations can increase the apparent credit worthiness of these projects in order to attract more private money. Now, ideally, it should be possible to do this without reducing any of the poverty-oriented investment, simply by expanding the scale of operation of the World Bank and the ADB. But unfortunately, there's no agreement on that in the G20. And industrialized countries have tended not to look favorably on any such proposal. Usually the argument is there's more than enough money in the world. If only you get your policies right, if you have a good infrastructure project, you should be able to finance it. That's actually true if there's no market failure. But I think there are market failures. So the question is that a role for the G20 to get into? This is still an open question because this has been discussed in 2010. And we do not yet have a concrete response from the multilateral agencies on how they can address this question.
Are there other questions? We'll take one more round, Montek, of questions. Yeah? Is the gentleman back there?
I think
Tom?
the IMF
Yes.
representative.
Good evening, sir. I'm B.K. Mitra from ITU APT Foundation. Sir, in your lecture, in the last part, you said that in G20 number of items had been added, and the recent one is the gender issue, which you mentioned, sir. I think, sir, besides the gender issue, women empowerment, that is also one of the important issue which has to be taken up because they contribute a lot for the economy of a country. And among the women, also there must be sub-classification, the rural women and the urban women, because the urban women, they use the more technology, rural women, they are less. But they are equally creative, equally this thing. So this thing is just, you consider this.
No, I don't disagree, by the way, about the importance of the gender. The limited issue that I think is coming up is really eliminate the gender differential in workforce participation rates, because actually they're quite high. And in India too, they're quite high. So I don't disagree with that. My point really is that there are so many things that countries should be aiming at, and maybe there's a role. This is not very different from the Millennium Development Goals. Like saying, we all agree that if you do more schooling, if you do more of this, more of this, more of the other, etc., your country will be better off. And yes, the G20 could do that. But you know, what is really important is when the G20 said, look, we're the top 20 countries in some manner of speaking, and we're going to evolve a consensus on how the World Bank is going to be run, how the IMF is going to be run, how we're going to negotiate in trade, what we're going to do in climate change. Now, those are very concrete areas where progress can be made. Otherwise, we're just endorsing good things. You know, obviously, anti-corruption, a wonderful thing. Everybody in the world is agreed. But exactly what is the worthwhileness of a G20 thing saying, you know, there are a couple of the anti-bribery convention, the OECD convention. But you know, the honest truth is that signing or not signing these conventions does not make a hell of a big difference on the extent of corruption, quite honestly. So I think one gets tempted into joining the listing of mantras. Nothing wrong with that. But I somehow don't feel, I do not feel that there is any operationally meaningful statement in these areas that the G20 can come out with. Let me give you another example. This is not to undermine. For example, on energy. You see, the formula that the G20 has consistently used, and I support it, is that we must get rid of energy, fossil fuel subsidies, and then we modified that, many other developing countries, you know, subject to some subsidies for the really, really deserving. So it's a qualified thing. Now, the point is that is an endorsement of, in my view, a very sensible thing. We've said that domestically in our own planning documents, and we find it very difficult to actually translate that into action. But, you know, it creates a global perception that, look, this is a good thing to do. But that's not the same thing as the IMF, as the G20 coming around and saying, we have now agreed that the World Bank will get capitalized, or given what it does, it's going to lend to infrastructure in this particular way. Because that's an executive decision which immediately translates into action. The other is an endorsement of principle, which has its role, but it's not a. I mean, if the G20 goes down that route, the problem is there'll be 50 principles that they'll be forced to endorse, because there's no supply constraint on principles. I don't think we should be getting into that too much. And by the way, the Millennium Development Goals already does that. I mean, the whole UN is doing it. So it's not very different from the G20 saying, we, the G20, commit ourselves to doing the best we can to improve our own Millennium Development Goal performance. There's no agreement. Nowhere does it say, and the bottom 30% who are not able to do it are going to be assisted. That's not there. So if all we're saying is we will do our best and we'll be exemplars, I mean, that's good. But that's not what you have summit meetings for. That's what you have the UN for.
Tom?
Tom Richardson from the IMF representative in India. And I just have a quick question. I quite agree with you, Montek, that the economics profession doesn't really have a firm consensus on how to deal with a lot of the issues, international cooperation and coordination issues that have come up. But in that context, I wonder if you'd like to comment or consider the discussions that Governor Rathin has made about international monetary cooperation and the debate a little bit between Bernanke and himself last fall, and whether there is an intellectual path or a way forward. Thanks.
Well, I think I didn't have the time. I should have drawn attention to it. But when I said that the large amounts of capital being highly volatile is a fundamental feature of the global system. And to some extent, the whole quantitative easing debate is really that in certain circumstances, industrialized countries may be following a particular policy. Then based on their domestic considerations, they reverse the policy. The impact of that reversal on developing countries can be massive. So should there be some discipline? Now this is part of what I meant, that we haven't actually gotten an architectural solution to that. One side of it is the IMF now says that we're not actually insisting on capital account liberalization. You can have some controls, but it doesn't actually. I mean, if I was a country running a country suddenly faced by a huge capital outflow, there's no IMF book that tells me, in these circumstances, these are the kind of controls that make sense. These are the kind of controls that don't make sense. These are the best controls to have. We don't have that. All we have is that if I do it, nobody's going to jump up and say, oh, what a terrible thing you've done. The same thing applies in case of monetary policy. I mean, what I think Raghu and others have succeeded in is an acceptance on the part of the central banks of industrialized countries that the issue is legitimate. Earlier the view was that first of all, it's outside our mandate. And it's true in the case of the Federal Reserve, their mandate is what's going to happen to the United States. So you could have a situation where somebody could say, look, this will have a very negative effect on these countries, and that'll feed back on the United States. Well, then the Fed would take it into account. But when you're the Fed, even if it doesn't feed back in the short run, the reputational damage that it does to the world's hegemon has to be also kept in mind. So somewhere or the other, you can get a little something. But I think what's been agreed to is much more transparency, much more consultation, and more gradual and predictable steps rather than sudden and strange steps. And I think they've made some progress there. A related issue here, by the way, I think the IMF in the last several years has been tending to say that, look, if you've got a lot of capital outflow possibilities, then you better protect yourself, which means build up huge amounts of reserves, do regional reserve agreements, which are all inefficient. I mean, the most cost-effective way of doing it is to have a centralized available fund of liquidity. But nobody's willing to endorse a large enough fund. So many countries are more or less being told that, look, if you want to protect yourself, have more reserves, enter into regional agreements, which means if you haven't entered into a regional agreement, don't blame me. And I think we need an architecture of that's, in my view, far more important than what happens to the quotas and so on. I mean, the difference for India, whether we become from 2 point something to 3 point something % in terms of voting is not that huge. But this is very crucial.
We have 2 more
I think
questions.
Ashima wanted to say
and
something, and somebody else there.
Back there, yes. So 2 more questions. And
actually, my question was related to Thomas. So you started by saying that macroeconomists...
I'm Dr. J.D. Agarwal from Indian Institute of
Macroeconomists
Finance.
neglect...
Just a second.
Dr. Agarwal, we have a question.
Ashima, why
and
don't
then
you stand up? And that then you...
Okay, Ashima Goyer. My question was actually related to Thomas. So you started by saying that macroeconomists take the financial sector for granted. But in a way, I think what Raghu has been saying is that monetary authorities at least are producing so much of liquidity, and they are forcing the financial sector to take more risks, build up again the kind of risks that were taken earlier. So they're compensating too much for the freezing in the financial sector, and that's building the same kinds of risks. But I agree with you when you say that the G20 should focus on coordination. So here, I think this is an issue where emerging markets and advanced economies need to sort of sit together and come together, and it would have, in terms of really building these architectural and some aspects of financial reform, perhaps, that could reduce the surges in capital flows.
No, I agree with my only point really, and I think this is actually widely now accepted, that liquidity is one thing that they've always taken into account. I mean, what will happen to the short-term interest rate if liquidity expands? Then, of course, there's the global movement of capital. But what I meant was that if you've got a financial sector that's broke, is it at all possible to get some kind of real economy development? That has tended to be understated. I mean, most of the macro models that are used don't actually model that at all. That's just assumed that, that'll never happen. But what will happen is a little bit of pressure on the interest rate. Short-term rate goes up, short-term rate goes down. Well, I think things have become more complicated, and they need to take that into account. Yeah, that was the last question.
there's the last, Dr. Agarwal. Dr. Agarwal.
I'm Dr. J.D. Agarwal. Different economies of the whole world have witnessed economic reforms and privatization over the last 25, 26 years. 70-year-old world financial institutions like World Bank and IMF have insisted time and again for different economic reforms to different economies. What kind of reforms do you think needed in World Bank and IMF? That is my first question, to make the global financial system more efficient, effective, and to avert the kind of financial crisis which the world economy faced in the last 6 years. The second question is there a need, which I think, which is very important to be considered, to restructure both the World Bank and the IMF, because they are carrying on their mission, their functioning, and their working, what they adopted 70 years ago. Thank you.
Well, I mean, in the context of the G20, the reform of these institutions has been very much on the agenda. But I think, as I implied, the focus has really been on some change in the voting share of the emerging developing countries, some complicated phrases used there, and also some reduction in the European representation in the IMF. That was all agreed, and it would be triggered as soon as the US administration is able to get Congress to ratify the quota increase that the US would have to make. And unfortunately, although they are trying, they've not been able to get congressional approval. So now, so some reform has been on the agenda. That's the only reform that could be agreed within the G20. So if your question is, do you want even more radical reform? That's not what was agreed. But even this is simply not being implemented. And I have no idea. We hope that it'll get implemented. But reforming institutions is a difficult task. But I want to emphasize here, by the way, that I forget now, but the total lending that the World Bank does per year is about $12 billion. So given the change that occurred in the world, I mean, whether you reform it or you don't reform it, it really doesn't make any difference. The IMF is potentially more important because when you need it, you really need support, and there's been lots of change there also. The main focus there has been, increasing the voting share and the voice of the developing countries. And the G20 did make a start, and they're hoping that they'll be able to implement it. That's about it. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Montek. I think we owe him a big round of applause for, I think, what has been a perfect start to our 6th G20 conference, which will get underway tomorrow morning, the technical sessions. And many of the things that Montek has discussed and that you've brought out will be discussed tomorrow, including whether the G20's agenda should be limited or whether it's gotten involved in mission creep and how good that is, whether it's endorsing principles that are better kind of tackled by institutions that are created specifically for that purpose. All of these are going to be discussed in our technical sessions over the next day and a half. I do want to say something about the point that Montek made, not when he was speaking, but when he was responding to the questions about infrastructure. And I was struck because I recently read, I think it's a IMF study which says that the impact that long-term financing or investment in infrastructure has had on countries, both short-term effects on growth as well as long-term effects. I think it's an IMF study. I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman. They are not what they had promised to be. And part of the reasons I think Montek already referred to is that projects that tend to get implemented, enough due diligence hasn't been done on those projects. So projects that tend to get implemented are projects which have the higher visibility and probably capacity for rent seeking, etc. And that's, I think, an IMF paper. So those are interesting issues to discuss when we talk about the role of the G20 in getting emerging markets to invest in infrastructure, and whether private money will be forthcoming when such multilateral investments come into emerging markets. So some of those issues will also be discussed tomorrow. But I think this has been a wonderful, wonderful start to a very thought-provoking, very good ideas. Montek, as always, very articulate, very thought-provoking, and perhaps provocative as well, as he promised to be in the beginning. So thank you, Montek, on behalf of ICRIER and on behalf of all the supporting institutions for this conference, which is, well, let me name them once more. Sound like a TV announcer, but let me name all the institutions: the Australian High Commission, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and the World Bank. Thank you so much for supporting this conference. And let me invite all of you for cocktails and dinner. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Montek. That was brilliant.
So we had nice, I might try and drop in on some of these sessions, just to listen. Where are we going for dinner?
Here, right here.
Oh, here?
Yes, right here. Oh, yes, yes. Before housekeeping announcement that I wish to make: instead of 9:30 tomorrow, so instead of coming in at 9 and registering until 9:30, may I request you, all of you,